Okay. Welcome to the Duty to Warn podcast. I'm your host, John Gartner, and today we are lucky to have Dr. Edwin Fisher with us. Dr. Fisher is a clinical psychologist, and he's a professor at the Gilling School of Global Public Health at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Dr. Fisher, you wrote a letter to the New York Times in February after Donald Trump tweeted that he had been tapped by Barack Obama. And what was it that made you feel that it was important to write that letter to the New York Times?
Well, I wrote it on a Sunday morning, got up, read the articles, the news reports of his outlandish claim about Obama, and after about half a cup of coffee, just decided that I needed to do something about it. And so I tapped out no pun intended, tapped out a letter to the Times, not expecting it to be taken, but very gratified when it was. But to me, I was a little concerned that people in the field talking about does he fit this diagnosis or that diagnosis somewhat missed the point. Clearly, he's got a lot of psychological problems. But without applying a diagnosis, it is clear that he is reckless, impulsive, self-absorbed. We could go on, and that these characteristics pose a real danger to society and to the world, really. And so the argument I tried to make in that letter was that whether or not it's this or that diagnosis, what's really important is the danger he constitutes in his behavior and his conduct of his office.
Could you say more about that? About what are the things that make you see signs of danger, and what are the dangers that you worry about?
Well, in the tweet about Obama, there is the impulsivity of it, the fact that it was done, I forget, early in the morning on a Sunday morning.
The famous 3 a.m. tweet.
Yes, and, obviously without any screening or consultation of advisors, for a sitting president to make an accusation about a former president without discussing it just represents a lack of understanding of his office, a lack of understanding of the office, a lack of understanding of how these affairs ought to be conducted, a lack of recognition that his own immediate perspectives on things need to be discussed with others before they're acted on. So impulsivity, recklessness, a real lack of appreciation of the consequences of what he's doing, very much a kind of in the moment, almost childish approach to things, and destructive. As many have discussed over the past several months, the way in which we comport ourselves in our civil society and in our government is really important. We can't expect people to respect each other and to respect the government and respect the people in the government if leaders are acting with gross disrespect for each other. So, I could go on, but I think all of these made me feel that there's a real case of President Trump's constituting a danger to all of us in his office, and that's what I wanted to focus attention on. Clearly, that danger has psychological roots, but whether it's this or that particular psychological characteristic is not as important as the dangers to which they lead.
Right. And now in the letter, you point to three things that you thought were indicative of Trump's mental state that you thought made it dangerous, made the tweet dangerous, or the state of mind that led to the tweet dangerous.
Sure.
One was the content, you said, the fact that it had no evidence.
Right.
The other was that it was loosely and poorly worded. And the last was that it was an affront to precedence and decorum. Maybe you could speak to those three factors.
Right. I mean, the content was, as you say, without evidence, and since then there has been no evidence to support the content, with the possible exception that information on some of Trump's people may have been gathered through monitoring of Russians who are properly monitored by our intelligence agencies. Right. To say that Obama did this as if Obama sat in his bedroom or the Oval Office and directed this activity was just outrageous. So that is totally without ground. The tweet, I don't remember the exact wording of the tweet, but it was poorly worded, poorly constructed, as you know, a number of his have been since then, and now frequently his defenders say, well, you know, these were not carefully worded as a defense. Well, this is the President of the United States. His words matter. His words can launch nuclear weapons. And for him to be casual in his public words, especially talking about another president, just again points to his lack of appreciation of his role in his office. And I forget the third one.
Well, you had touched on it a little bit earlier, but an affronts to precedent and decorum.
Yeah. You know, I don't know how many people watching this podcast have ever been to a session of Congress or even a session of a city council. But if you're not familiar with it, it seems a little bit strange. People are saying, oh, my honored colleague from the great state of Abadigash, I yield the floor. And there's all of this decorum. And, you know, you can say, why don't these people just talk straight? Well, it turns out that these people, our representatives, are talking about things that are of tremendous moment for all of us. And they're talking about things about which they have very hard opinions and about which they have very hard disagreements. And, you know, these things really matter. Will they get reelected? Will their bill get passed? Whatever. So the stakes are very high. And what it seems to me is that formal decorum is really necessary to preserve the orderly conduct of their offices. It's what keeps fights from breaking out on the floor of the Senate or the House of Representatives, as we see in other countries. Every once in a while you'll see a video on the evening news of two representatives in some chamber in some other country having at each other. And so decorum is not just a fussy thing from charm school. Decorum has a real functional role in allowing great disagreements to get resolved and for the affairs of the country to go forward in an orderly way without people coming apart. You know, a lot of people gave great credit to President Obama for his immediate almost embrace of President-elect Trump a day or two after the election, inviting him to the White House, making clear that we were going to have an orderly transfer of power. That is tremendously important. One can imagine the difficulty of an orderly transfer of power from President Trump to another if the person to whom he's transferring power is somebody about which he's made tweets accusing them of criminal behavior. So this is not just the fussiness over offensive language, political correctness. Uh, this sense of orderly, decorous conduct of our affairs is of genuine importance to all of us.
And as a professor of public health, I think you probably also are thinking about the role that civility or decorum plays in our society in general.
Yes.
Do you feel that in some ways, how do you feel Trump's election has affected the public health in this area or others?
Well, when the President of the United States says about a demonstrator being removed from one of his rallies, beat the crap out of him, how does a parent talk to her or his child about the importance of working out disputes in a peaceful, non-combative way? I mean, this is horrible. We know, you and I are both clinical psychologists, there is gobs of data that the modeling and the portrayal of violence provokes violence. It does not give a peaceful outlet for hostile urges. It provokes them, and it provokes their actions on them. So when the President of the United States talks about people being the enemy of the American people, about people being bad people, about people being evil, about the press being corrupt, about the press being liars, all of this kind of talk foments an atmosphere of conflict, of rudeness, of anger, of aggression in our society. That is not good for any of us. I think you and I and most psychologists would agree that that talk is not unrelated to the attack on the congressman from Louisiana a week ago. As it happened, it was a liberal who pulled the trigger, but the liberal pulled the trigger in an atmosphere in which the anger and the emotions had been fanned and provoked, and in which increasingly people feel like there are no holds barred. And the president has a great deal of responsibility for having encouraged that atmosphere, and he cannot escape it.
And there's been a huge increase in documented hate crimes against all sorts of groups, swastikas and Jewish cemeteries being defaced, but also so many stories, many of which are just anecdotal, some of which have been recorded in statistics of Muslims and immigrants being harassed.
Yeah. And, you know, and also in lots of reports now of, this is skipping ahead perhaps a little bit, but lots of reports now of people feeling emotional distress in general in our country. I was struck by a phenomenon, perhaps you observed it as well. For about the first month or so after the election, everyone that I talked to, if you talked about election night, one of the first things they said was when they turned the television off. Everybody had a clear idea as when they turned the television off. To me, having been 18 at the time, it was reminiscent of John Kennedy's assassination, where everybody knows where they heard the news, what they were doing, where they were standing, whom they were talking with when they heard that President Kennedy had been shot. You know, for many of us, obviously not for those who supported President Trump, but for many of us, this was really a traumatic moment in our lives, you know, we will only see what the longer-term consequences are.
It's interesting that you compare it to the moment that Kennedy was shot. I am old enough also to remember that, and I agree with you that it struck people with that level of force and trauma.
Yeah. As it happens, I teach a course um, on Wednesday mornings in the fall semester. So I met my students at 10 o'clock the next morning, and we had to spend about the first 45 minutes just picking up the pieces.
So have you noticed, or what are your thoughts about the effect of his election on women and people who have been maybe victims of some kind of sexual assault?
Well, I think, again, this is, if you're a mother, how do you tell your daughter to feel confident in her interactions with men and interactions in the world when the president has said the horrible things he has said about women and apparently behaved in a exploitative, self-absorbed, selfish manner with women. I'm sorry, I lost my train there. I assume you can edit this.
Yeah, no problem. Well, you also wrote a book, you wrote an article, in Bandy Lee's book about Trump relating to decision-making. Do you want to say
Yes.
more about what it was you explored in that article?
Yeah, so in the article, what I started off with this perspective a number of months ago when people said, well, it's okay, he'll have a lot of smart advisors. And I thought back to the Cuban Missile Crisis with President Clinton, and to me the really important lesson of that, or a really important lesson of that, was that President Kennedy had very smart advisors, and he held them close, he gathered them around. The only problem was the advisors disagreed, and they disagreed markedly. Some of them said that we should bomb Cuba and take out those missiles, and some of them said we should ignore it. One was quoted as saying, we're making a big deal over missiles in Cuba. It really doesn't matter where the missile comes from. It's still going to kill many Americans. And so President Kennedy had marked disagreement among his very intelligent advisors. And at the end, as he put it, I'm coming close to quoting, there stands the decision and there stands the president. And it's just the two of them. He has to call the shot. So when you look at the way in which President Trump responds to things, you really become worried about his ability to be the sober, wise, judicious, thoughtful person calling the shot. He received a lot of praise for his firing Scud missiles a couple of months ago after seeing the video of the little boy chemo attacked in Syria. But think about what he did. He made that decision while he was in the midst of hosting President Xi of China at Mar-a-Lago. The missile launch actually occurred during dinner. He didn't interrupt his dinner. There was no immediate urgency to the missile launch. It could have been done 2 days later or 3 days later. I think it's not trivial that how many of us feel confident that with the provocation this week of the death of the student who was horribly imprisoned by the North Koreans, with his death, how many of us feel confident that the president is not going to do something rambunctious with North Korea which is a powder keg none of us want to light a fuse to. So I think these are that recognition that when you elect a president, he's not, or she is not just a sifter and a curator of advice and then move it forward. He's not just a filter for that advice. The president, in President Bush's perhaps wrongfully criticized term, is the decider. And that is his most important role. And I think any deep look into President Trump's background and the decisions he's made in his life would lead one to question his ability to carry that out.
And it sounds like you're concerned that he might make some sort of impulsive decision that could lead to war.
Yes. I mean, you and I know, consider, for instance, the example of somebody who's in an abusive relationship. And, you know, the abuse begins with verbal abuse, and then the verbal abuse increases. What is a major observation we have to guide our actions in such a circumstance? It is that, hey, verbal abuse is a predecessor of physical and much worse abuse. Abuse is abuse. When people start treating each other abusively, that's a bad sign. When the President of the United States writes a tweet accusing his predecessor of criminal action without discussing it with anybody at 3 o'clock or 6 o'clock in the morning, that no clinician would look at that and say, this is a person who shows good signs of maturity and sober judgment in whose hands we can place the fate of the world.
Yeah.
Nobody would make that assessment.
I think that's very well put. And your point about decision making actually brings up another point, which is the kind of wish fulfillment or the fantasy that will be okay because he's going to surround himself with good people.
Yeah.
What we've observed is he's not very restrainable by good people. The example I would think of is when he went to NATO and Mattis put into his speech an affirmation of Article 5, which of course is the raison d'etre of NATO, which is an attack against one is an attack against all. We being the only country that's been the beneficiary of that Article 5, he took it out of the speech. He didn't say it, and that became an international incident. So there's really a question with his impulsivity and his grandiosity, whether he can be restrained or even influenced by his advisors.
Yeah, I mean, as many have expressed, some with some concern, some with great respect, General Mad Dog Mattis is not exactly a shrinking violet. When President Trump says, thanks, Mad Dog, but I'm going to give the speech the way I want it, you know, what does that represent in terms of his arrogance and inflated sense of his own wisdom and ability?
Well, you know, he knows more about ISIS than the generals, you know.
Yes, exactly. So, you know, and this is not, you know, people can say, oh, it was only a speech. No, it wasn't only a speech. You know, 2 days later, you had the German president saying, we must move forward without assuming that America has our back. That is a monumental impact on global diplomacy. So if the president feels that he can ignore his advisors with that, again, it's sort of like the verbal abuse is a harbinger of worse things to come. what other things might he feel that he can ignore his advisors on? That is a great concern.
And that's why you felt the need to warn the public and to write that letter in the New York Times.
Yes, and I also added in the chapter some ideas about how President Trump has sort of isolated himself. He is always the Donald, and seems to relish being always the Donald. We know that a source of mental health is having multiple roles in your life. So you can complain to your coworkers about your kids, and you complain to your spouse about your coworkers. That helps you stay healthy, helps you find a balance. To the extent that President Trump has isolated himself, has the same advisors, doesn't treat Mar-a-Lago as a retreat from the White House, but as an extension of the White House. So he entertains foreign visitors there, conducts, major discussions at a dining room table in a public area of the restaurant. He is putting himself in something of a cocoon. We know, of the dangers of the president being isolated in a bubble, as they say. President Trump seems to be thickening the walls of the bubble, so that in combination with his feeling entitled to ignore advice and to ignore precedent, etc., is a great concern.
And I think this trend is actually accelerating now that everyone in the White House seems to need their own personal lawyer,
Yes.
meaning that their interests are not aligned, that everybody needs to, essentially, every man for himself. And Trump is increasingly expressing his rage over his frustration at his own staff. So throwing them under the bus, as the phrase is, or contradicting things he's asked them to say a few days later, or just plain they're worrying about whether this guy's going to get them in legal trouble. So it seems like that trend towards isolation is actually accelerating or increasing.
Yes, and increasing reports from the staff that he is impervious to advice or consultation. It's just whatever he wants, or as the frequent observation is, whomever he's talked to most recently, that's the decision. I was struck. There was a piece in the New Yorker in May that had a quotation from Steve Schmidt, who was Senator Gaines' campaign manager in 2008, and he said, "There's nobody in the White House who can talk to Trump. Nobody." That is a real concern.
That's very dangerous.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Fisher, I really want to thank you for talking to us from North Carolina, where decorum is always followed, or usually, often.
I'll leave aside comments on North Carolina.
Okay. I was trying to throw a plug in there. But I do appreciate your taking the time to talk to us, and I think your perspective is very valuable. Thank you for taking the time.
Great. I enjoyed it.
Me too. Nice meeting you.
Just hang on a minute, John. I